It was just another stop on their ride, a roadside diner off the highway, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt, the floors are sticky, and the jukebox in the corner hasn't worked right in years. They pulled up loud, engines roaring, leather jackets creaking as they swung off their bikes, filling the parking lot with the smell of gasoline and cigarette smoke. And then they saw him. A man sitting alone in a booth near the window, broad shoulders, head shaved close, wearing a plain hoodie like he wasn't trying to be noticed. He didn't look like much, just another guy passing through, just another traveler minding his own business. But something about him rubbed them the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he sat too still, too relaxed. Maybe it was the way he barely even glanced up when they walked in, like he wasn't impressed, like he wasn't the least bit concerned. They had no idea who he was. Not yet. But they were about to find out. The air inside the diner smelled like grease and stale coffee, the kind of place that had seen 1,000 road trips, 1,000 weary travelers stopping in for a quick bite before disappearing down the highway. The bikers had been here before, or at least to places like this. It was their kind of spot, uncomplicated, rough around the edges, a place where nobody asked questions. Tonight, though, something was different. They had noticed him the second they walked in, a man sitting alone in the corner booth, hunched slightly over his plate, moving slow, deliberate. He wasn't a regular. He wasn't from around here. And the way he didn't react, that was what did it. When men like them walked into a place, people noticed. Waitresses stiffened, other customers glanced up, some looked away. But this guy? He just kept eating. No flinch. No acknowledgement. Like they weren't even there. And that, to them, was disrespect. The bikers had seen a lot of people in places like this, truckers, drifters, men trying to disappear into their meals, women who looked tired of running, kids who had nowhere else to be. But this guy was different. Not because he was trying to stand out, because he wasn't. He sat still, too still, his movements slow, measured, the kind of guy who didn't waste energy on anything that didn't matter. His hoodie was plain, nothing flashy, nothing screaming for attention. His head was shaved close, his frame solid under the fabric, the kind of build that suggested a man who had spent his whole life knowing exactly how to carry himself. And that was the problem. Because men like that, men who didn't flinch, men who didn't make room, men who sat in their own silence without adjusting to the presence of others, they pissed guys like Tank off. When the group walked in, the diner felt them. Not just the people, the whole place. The air changed. The hum of conversation dipped. The waitress behind the counter stiffened slightly, the cook in the back peeked out just long enough to see who had come in before pretending to focus on his grill. The kind of reaction that said these guys had been in places like this before, and places like this knew how to handle men like them. Stay quiet, stay quick, don't give them a reason to linger. They were loud on purpose. The boots against the tile. The scrape of chairs as they took over a few tables near the center of the room. The chuckle that was just a little too sharp, the kind of sound that wasn't about humor, but about being heard. The man in the booth didn't even look. Tank wasn't used to that. It wasn't just that the guy hadn't acknowledged them, it was how completely he hadn't. Didn't shift in his seat. Didn't flick his eyes up. Didn't even pause what he was doing, didn't let the moment settle into his movements. Like they weren't even a variable. That wasn't how it worked. When a group like them walked into a place like this, people reacted. They always reacted. A glance, a nod, a quick assessment. Some men gave that nervous smile, that instinctive I'm no threat expression. Some guys tried too hard to act normal, gripping their mugs tighter, staring just a little too long at their food. Some idiots even tried to act tough, puffing out their chests just enough to prove they weren't intimidated. But this guy? Nothing. That wasn't normal. Tank wasn't the kind of man to let something like that slide. It wasn't even about the guy, not really. It was about what it looked like. A man ignoring them in public, in front of people. That wasn't how things were supposed to go. So he made it a thing. Loud enough for the whole diner to hear. loud enough that the guy in the booth would have to acknowledge him. "Look at this guy," he muttered, tilting his head toward the booth. "Too good to say hello?" One of the younger guys, Slim, snorted, playing along, sensing where this was going. "Maybe he didn't hear us over all that. What's that sound?" "Oh, right." The world revolving around him. Laughter. Low, rough, the kind meant to make an impression. A moment passed. And still, nothing. Tank's smirk twitched. This was the part where the guy was supposed to react. Not in a big way, not in some dramatic, movie scene kind of way, but at least in a human way. A glance. A sigh. A forced chuckle. Even an annoyed "leave me alone." But what did this guy do? He finished chewing. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. And then, moving at a pace so steady it felt intentional, he reached for his coffee, lifted it to his lips, took a sip. Only then, only after he had done all of that, did he finally look up. Not turning his head fast. Not snapping his attention toward them like someone who had just realized they were in a situation. Slow. Deliberate. In control. And his eyes? Too calm. Tank felt something twist in his gut. It was the first warning. He ignored it. Men who didn't know how to fight always did one of two things when confronted. They either froze up, that flicker of panic crossing their face, the kind of hesitation that said they weren't sure if they should argue, back down, or try to laugh it off. Or they puffed up, straightened their backs, widened their stance, made themselves look bigger than they really were. This guy did neither. His face was unreadable. Not blank, not emotionless, just steady. The kind of face a man had when he had nothing to prove. And that was a problem. Tank had been in enough fights to recognize when the energy changed. This wasn't how these things usually went. This wasn't some nervous kid trying to act tough, wasn't some hot-headed trucker who didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. This was something else. And then, from just over his shoulder, he heard Slim's voice. Low. Uneasy. Tank. Tank didn't take his eyes off the man in the booth. What? Slim swallowed hard. I think that's Mike Tyson. The name didn't register at first. Not because Tank didn't know it, but because his brain wasn't ready to process it. Mike Tyson. Not a Mike Tyson. Not some guy who just happened to have the same name. The Mike Tyson. The world's most dangerous heavyweight. The man who knocked people out like it was his second nature. The man who didn't need to act tough because everyone already knew he was. And Tank? Tank had just made himself a problem. Slim took a step back. Then another. He wasn't the only one. The other bikers, the ones who had been smirking, had been waiting for a show, suddenly weren't so sure anymore. But Tank was too deep in it. He had started something. And men like him, men who ran off pride and reputation, they didn't back down. Even when they should. Tank exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to scoff, to shake off the weight of the name, to pretend like it didn't matter. So what? He muttered, trying to sound unimpressed. Big deal. And then, because he didn't know how to stop himself, because his whole life had been about proving he was the toughest man in the room, because he was about to make the worst mistake of his night, he reached out. Just a shove. Just a hand on the shoulder. Just a little push to remind this guy that this was his space. And that was the third mistake. Something had changed. It wasn't obvious, wasn't loud, wasn't something you could put your finger on if you weren't paying attention, but it was there, a subtle shift, like the weight of the room had tilted just slightly, like the space between them and the man in the booth had stretched and compressed all at once. Tank could feel it, even if he didn't understand it yet. It was in the way his crew had stopped smirking, in the way Slim had taken that extra step back, in the way the waitress behind the counter had frozen, gripping a coffee pot like she wasn't sure whether to pour or run. Tank was a man who thrived on control. He controlled rooms, controlled people, controlled situations with his presence alone. But now, for the first time in a long time, something wasn't responding the way it should. And the worst part? He didn't know why. Mike Tyson. The name was big, bigger than the moment, bigger than the diner, bigger than whatever game Tank had thought he was playing when he first opened his mouth. It was the kind of name that carried weight even when the man it belonged to wasn't saying a damn word. The kind of name that made smart men think twice. The kind of name that should have sent a lightning bolt of back the hell off straight down Tank's spine. But pride? Pride was a hell of a thing. It made men ignore warning signs. It made them blind to the way a situation was unraveling beneath their feet. It made them make decisions they couldn't take back. Tank had seen men crack before. He knew what it looked like when someone's confidence started to slip, when they realized they were in deeper than they thought. The quick dart of the eyes, the twitch of a jaw, the shift in stance, little giveaways that most people missed, but Tank always caught. But Tyson? Tyson wasn't doing any of that. His face was still, his expression unreadable, his posture completely at ease. Not because he was ignoring what was happening, not because he wasn't aware of it, but because he had already figured it out before anyone else had. He wasn't waiting to see what Tank would do. He was waiting for Tank to catch up. Tank had been in enough fights to know what a man's hands could tell you before he even threw a punch. Some men carried their tension in their fingers, clenching them into fists before their mind had even decided to swing. Others fidgeted, flexing their knuckles like they needed to remind themselves they were ready. Tyson? His hands weren't tense. They weren't fidgeting. They weren't doing anything at all. They just rested there on the table, completely relaxed, like he was waiting for the check instead of sitting across from a man who had just made a terrible decision. And that was worse than a clenched fist. Most men postured before a fight. It was instinct: widen your stance, square your shoulders, make yourself bigger than you actually are. But Tyson hadn't moved. Not an inch. And yet, somehow, he was taking up more space than anyone else in the room. He hadn't tensed, hadn't adjusted his position, hadn't so much as shifted his weight. Because he didn't need to. Because men like him didn't ask permission from gravity. Tank should have known something was wrong just by looking at his own crew. Slim wasn't the only one backing off now. The others, guys who normally lived for this kind of situation, who loved the thrill of a fight, of a show, of watching their leader put some unlucky bastard in his place, were silent. Nobody was egging him on. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody wanted any part of this. And that silence? That silence was the loudest thing in the room. Tank had a choice. Right then, right there, he could have stopped. He could have made a joke, brushed it off, walked out of the diner with his crew behind him like nothing had happened. And if he had, Tyson wouldn't have cared. He wasn't here to prove anything. But men like Tank, men who built their entire identity on being the biggest presence in every room they walked into, they didn't know how to back down. Even when they should. It wasn't much. It wasn't hard. Just a simple shove. A hand on Tyson's shoulder, a quick little push, the kind meant to remind someone of where they stood. The kind that worked on most men. But not this man. Because the second Tank's fingers made contact, the instant that touch landed on Tyson's body, everything changed. The shift was immediate. Tyson didn't tense. Didn't jerk. Didn't react with any wasted movement. He just moved. And Tank never even saw it coming. Later, when Tank tried to replay it in his mind, when he tried to figure out what the hell had just happened, he wouldn't even be able to describe it. Because it wasn't a punch. It wasn't some wild swing, wasn't a bar fight haymaker, wasn't the kind of thing Tank was used to seeing in fights that were more about ego than actual skill. It was faster than that. Smoother. More precise. Like Tyson had already known exactly where Tank was going to be before Tank had even moved. And before Tank's body even registered that something had changed, before he could react, before he could breathe, he was already falling. Tank hit the ground before he even knew what happened. 1 second, he was standing. The next, his back was against the cold linoleum, his jaw felt like someone had driven a truck through it, and the ceiling tiles above him were spinning. And Tyson? Tyson was still sitting. Didn't even stand up. Didn't even look at him like he was worth getting out of his seat for. Just sat there. Calm. Collected. Like nothing had happened at all. The moment Slim said it, Tyson, the name landed in the air like a dropped weight, heavy, immediate, undeniable, the kind of name that doesn't just pass through a conversation but stays, lingering, thickening the space between everyone in the room, making it impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend like the situation was still what it had been 10 seconds ago, before anyone realized who exactly was sitting in that booth, who exactly had been ignoring them, who exactly they had just picked a fight with for no reason other than their own egos pushing them toward a mistake they couldn't take back. And Tank? Tank heard the name, he understood the name, he knew the name better than he wanted to admit, but knowing something and accepting it are two completely different things, and the way his body locked up, the way his throat felt too dry, the way his brain suddenly started processing every tiny detail, the way the guy moved, the way he didn't flinch, the size of his damn hands, all of it hit him at once, too late, too hard, too real, and he wasn't sure whether the wave of heat rolling through his chest was anger or embarrassment or some sick mixture of both, but whatever it wasn't letting him back down now. There was always a point in a fight, long before the first punch is thrown, when both men know exactly how it's going to end, whether they admit it to themselves or not, and right now, standing in that diner with his crew suddenly too quiet behind him, with the weight of the waitress's stare pressing against the side of his head, with Tyson still not moving, not flinching, not acknowledging any of the usual bullshit that makes most guys feel like they have control, Tank knew, he knew, that this was already over, but knowing and stopping are two different things, and men like him never stopped until they had no other choice. Tyson hadn't spoken since that single no problem, hadn't changed his expression, hadn't shifted an inch, hadn't done a damn thing except sit there watching, and that was the part that made Tank's skin itch. The part that made him feel like he was the one being steadied, weighed, measured, the part that made him want to swing just to wipe that look off his face, because Tyson wasn't looking at him like a threat, wasn't looking at him like a man about to make a mistake, wasn't even looking at him like a fighter. He was looking at him like someone who had seen this exact same thing happen 1,000 times before, like someone who already knew exactly how it was going to end, like someone who wasn't concerned, wasn't interested, wasn't invested, because it simply didn't matter. And that was worse than anything else. Tank could feel the shift behind him before he even turned to look, could sense the way Slim was already backing off, could hear the way the others were waiting instead of laughing, could tell, without needing to ask, that they had made the decision before he had, they had put it together before he did, they had figured it out and adjusted, they had recognized what this moment actually was, and they wanted no part of it, no part of him, no part of what was about to happen if Tank kept standing. They're pretending like the ground wasn't already shifting under his feet. And that should have been enough. That should have been the moment where he took the out, where he laughed, where he threw his hands up and made some excuse about not wanting to ruin a good meal, where he backed out the way every single person in the diner was silently hoping he would, but pride doesn't let go that easy, and Tank wasn't the kind of man to take a loss before he even threw a punch, no matter how stupid that decision was. It was right there, a single second, a moment so small it barely existed, a window where everything could have stopped before it started, before the heat in his chest took over, before his ego made the decision for him, before his hand moved just a little too far, before he reached out, not a punch, not a grab, just a shove, a test, a stupid attempt to push the moment somewhere else, somewhere that made sense, somewhere that didn't feel like he was standing in the middle of a free fall with nothing to hold on to. But the second his hand touched Tyson's shoulder, it was over. Tank had been hit before, had been in enough fights to recognize the way a punch winds up, the way a guy shifts his weight, the way you can sometimes see it coming just fast enough to brace for impact, just fast enough to throw your own back, but this wasn't like that. This wasn't a punch he saw coming. This wasn't something he could react to. This wasn't something he had a defense for, because he never even saw it leave the man's body. There was no wind-up, no telegraph, no warning, just speed, just power, just a flash of movement that started and ended before his brain could even register what had happened, before his nerves could fire the signal to react, before his body could do anything other than get hit and go down. Tank had never really thought about the space between getting hit and hitting the ground, had never paid attention to the way that moment stretches, the way time does something strange when your body isn't the thing in control anymore, the way your mind tries to catch up, tries to understand, tries to grasp what just happened before your back slams into the floor, before the sound in your skull drowns out the rest of the world, before you stop being a man standing and start being a man lying on his back with his pride leaking out onto the dirty tile of a roadside diner. Tyson hadn't stood up. That was the part Tank hated the most, more than the pain, more than the heat behind his eyes, more than the taste of blood at the back of his throat. Tyson hadn't even needed to stand up. Hadn't needed to plant his feet. Hadn't needed to adjust. Hadn't needed to do anything other than what he had done, because Tank had never been a threat in the first place. Nobody helped him up. Not because they didn't care, not because they wanted to see him suffer, but because what were they gonna do? Fight? Against Tyson? Against a man who had just dropped their leader without standing up, without breaking a sweat, without even looking like it had mattered? No. They weren't that stupid. Tank could have stayed down, could have let the moment pass, could have given himself a second to breathe before figuring out how the hell he was supposed to stand up again, but pride doesn't let you rest. Pride doesn't let you think. Pride doesn't let you do the smart thing, and so he rolled onto his side, pushed himself up, wiped the blood from his lip, and took a shaky step backward toward the door without saying a damn word, because what the hell was there left to say? Tank had been in fights before, had been in situations where words turned into actions, where a stare turned into a swing, where a mistake turned into a lesson, but never, not once, had he been in a moment where everything had unraveled before he even had a chance to start, where the fight had been taken from him before he had the chance to decide whether or not he wanted to throw a punch, where he had already lost before he even knew what losing felt like, because it wasn't just about the hit. Wasn't just about the fact that he was on the ground when a few seconds ago he had been standing, wasn't just about the fact that his jaw felt like it had been struck by a brick moving at the speed of sound. It was about what it meant, about what everyone else in that room had just seen, about the fact that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the moment. Pride is a funny thing, because it doesn't listen to logic, doesn't acknowledge pain, doesn't recognize when it should step aside, doesn't care that every single person in that room already knew exactly how this had played out, doesn't care that there wasn't a single path forward that didn't end in further humiliation, doesn't care that Tank's body was screaming at him to stay down, to sit this one out, to take the loss and leave with at least some shred of dignity intact. No, pride makes you do the thing you shouldn't do, makes you push yourself up onto your hands, makes you plant your foot against the dirty tile, makes you grind your teeth through the pain and rise back to your feet. Even when standing doesn't change a damn thing, even when standing just means you're giving the world a front row seat to the moment where you decide whether or not you're about to make the same mistake twice. There was a moment, a brief, flickering moment, where Tank could have told himself that his guys still had his back, that this wasn't over, that they were just waiting for his lead, waiting to see how he wanted to play this, waiting to follow his next move. But the second he turned his head, the second his gaze flicked over Slim and the rest of them, the second he tried to find even the smallest hint that they were ready to jump in, he saw exactly what he didn't want to see, eyes already avoiding him, jaws clenched but not in preparation for a fight, bodies angled toward the door, like they had already figured out their exit, like they had already decided they weren't going to be part of whatever was about to happen next, like they had already distanced themselves from the idiot who had just taken a punch from a man they all knew damn well they had no business messing with. There were a lot of ways fights ended. Some ended in broken bones, some ended in blood, some ended in police sirens and flashing lights. But the worst endings, the ones that left the deepest scars, the ones that took the longest to recover from, were the ones that ended in silence, the ones where nobody even wanted to acknowledge what had just happened, the ones where nobody wanted to speak because saying something meant recognizing that this had been real, saying something meant accepting that Tank had just been put down in the middle of a diner by a man who never even had to stand up to do it, saying something meant confirming that the fight had ended before it had even started. And this was that kind of fight. Tank's body still wanted to move, still wanted to prove that he wasn't done, still wanted to push forward, still wanted to grab onto whatever was left of his pride, but his brain had caught up now. His brain had finally processed what had just happened. His brain had finally put together all the pieces that had been floating around in his head from the moment Slim said the name. His brain had finally stopped lying to him, finally stopped making excuses, finally stopped pretending like there was any other way this was going to end, finally accepted that this was done, this was over, this was something he was never going to win. Leaving should have been easy, should have been the simplest part of the night, should have just been a turn toward the door, a few steps across the tile, a hand pushing against the glass, a body stepping into the cold air, a bike engine roaring to life, a road swallowing up the humiliation. But it wasn't easy, wasn't simple, wasn't something his body wanted to do, because leaving meant admitting it, meant accepting it, meant acknowledging that whatever power he thought he had over that room had been an illusion, that whatever control he thought he had over the situation had never been his to hold, that whatever man he thought he was before he walked into that diner wasn't the man walking out. Tank had never hesitated before walking out of a place in his life, had never felt the weight of a door like it was pushing against him instead of opening in front of him, had never felt like the space between him and the outside world was longer than it should have been, had never had to force himself to move the way he was forcing himself now. Had never had to fight against the feeling that every step he took toward that door wasn't just a step away from a fight, but a step away from who he thought he was. Just as he reached for the handle, just as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, just as he convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, this would feel different once he was outside, he made one last mistake. He looked back. And Tyson? Tyson was still sitting there, still holding his coffee, still looking like nothing that had happened mattered enough for him to break his routine, still looking like this wasn't even a moment worth remembering, still looking at Tank with that same calm, unreadable, unbothered expression that made everything so much worse. Because this wasn't a fight Tyson had won. This was a fight he had never even needed to have. The bikes rumbled to life, loud, violent, drowning out whatever was left of the moment in the diner, trying to erase it, trying to turn it into just another night, trying to cover up what had happened. But it didn't work, it couldn't work, because nothing was the same anymore, because whatever Tank had been when he walked in wasn't what he was when he rode away, because no matter how many miles he put between himself and that booth, he was never going to outrun what had happened in there. Most fights fade over time, become stories, become exaggerations, become something to laugh about, but this one wasn't going anywhere. This one was going to sit in the back of his mind forever, was going to play on a loop every time he walked into a room, every time he squared up against a man, every time he thought about control, about dominance, about who he was supposed to be, because no matter how much time passed, no matter how many other fights he won, no matter how many times he tried to forget, there was one truth he would never escape. He had picked the wrong man, in the wrong place, on the wrong night, and he would never, ever make that mistake again. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the only sounds the steady rumble of engines beneath them, but for the first time in his life, Tank didn't hear it, didn't feel the usual comfort in the noise, didn't feel the power of the machine beneath him drowning out the weight in his chest. His crew rode in silence, no laughter, no side comments, no easy banters to break the tension, because there was nothing left to say, nothing that could erase what had happened back in that diner, nothing that could turn it into something they could joke about later. Nobody asked him if he was all right. Nobody checked in. Because they all knew, this wasn't the kind of thing you walked away from the same person you were before it happened. And Tank? Tank wasn't sure who he was now. The next day, the world moved on. The diner served breakfast like nothing had happened. The waitress poured coffee for tired truckers. The jukebox played its usual out-of-tune songs. And Mike Tyson? Mike Tyson never thought about it again. Because it wasn't a moment worth remembering for him. Because he had already forgotten about Tank before the door even closed behind him. But for Tank, it was different. Because there are some fights you lose and walk away from, and there are some fights you lose and carry with you forever. And this was the kind that stays. Forever.